There is a question I have been asked more times than I can count across 65 years of medicine, and I have never answered it the way I am about to answer it now. The question is this: is dementia inevitable? And for most of my career, I gave the careful answer, the measured answer, the answer that protected me professionally and left my patients with very little they could actually use. I would say something like, there are many factors, some within our control and some not, and that was true. But it was also, I have come to believe, a kind of cowardice. Because what I had actually observed, what I had watched happen again and again across 65 years and more than 4,000 patients was something far more specific than many factors. It was a pattern, a clear, repeating, almost predictable pattern. And I did not say so plainly enough, for long enough, to enough people. I am 91 years old now. I do not have time for careful answers anymore. My name is Dr. Chen Wei. I was born in Chengdu in 1934, trained first in Western medicine at the University of Hong Kong, and then spent 7 years studying traditional Chinese medicine under my own teacher, a man named Dr. Luo Baichen, who practiced until he was 88 and died with his mind completely intact, reading classical poetry in his garden on a Tuesday afternoon and simply not waking up on Wednesday morning. That is the kind of death I have spent my life trying to understand. Not the other kind, not the slow erasure, not the fog, the kind where a person remains fully themselves until the very last breath. Over 6.5 decades, I watched some patients arrive at that peaceful end, and I watched far too many others disappear long before their bodies gave out. I watched brilliant people lose their words. I watched loving people lose their families' faces. I watched proud, vital human beings become strangers to themselves. And across all of those years, across all of those heartbreaking losses, I began to see three things, three specific behaviors, three patterns of living that appeared in the histories of nearly every patient whose memory eventually failed them. Not one thing, not genetics alone, not bad luck, three things. Things that were chosen, even if they were chosen without knowing the cost. That is what I am going to tell you today. Not theory, not the latest research paper, though the research, as it turns out, has spent the last 20 years catching up to what I observed in my clinic long before anyone was measuring it. I am going to tell you what I saw with my own eyes, what I failed to say loudly enough for too long, and what I believe with everything I have left in me that you can still do something about. Whatever your age, whatever your history, whatever you have or have not been told. If this is the first time you have come to this channel, welcome. And if what you are about to hear matters to you, please consider subscribing, because everything I share here is simply what I know, given freely, while I still have the time and the clarity to give it. I would be grateful for your company. The first behavior, and the one I resisted naming for the longest time because it seemed too philosophical for a medical context, was the slow abandonment of curiosity. I watched it happen so many times that I eventually stopped being surprised by it, though I never stopped being saddened. A person would retire or suffer a significant loss or simply reach a point in life where the world had asked enough of them, and they would make a quiet, unconscious decision to stop reaching toward the new, to stop learning, to stop wondering, to settle entirely and permanently into what was already known and already comfortable. I understand the appeal. After a lifetime of effort and striving and adapting, the desire to simply rest within what is familiar is entirely human. But the brain does not work like a body that benefits from stillness. The brain is not a muscle that recovers by lying quietly. It is more like a vast and living forest, threaded through with pathways that only remain open as long as they are walked. Leave a path unworn for long enough, and the forest will take it back. This is not a metaphor. This is precisely what happens at the neurological level when mental engagement is withdrawn. The synaptic connections that are not regularly used are pruned, the pathway is thin, the forest slowly and without drama begins to close in. I had a patient, I will call him William, who came to me at 68, a retired solicitor from Edinburgh, still precise in his speech and formidable in his thinking. He told me that he had decided upon retirement to finally give his brain a rest. He had stopped reading case law, of course, but he had also stopped reading much of anything. He watched television in the evenings, took the same walk each morning, ate the same meals each week. He was comfortable. He told me with some satisfaction, no longer under any pressure. I saw him again at 72. Something behind the eyes had softened in a way that had nothing to do with contentment. At 75, his daughter brought him in. He could not always remember the day of the week. Now hear me carefully, because I do not want you to take the wrong thing from William's story. He was not a foolish man. He was not lazy or indifferent. He had simply never been told, as most people have never been told, that novelty is not a luxury for the aging brain. It is nutrition. The brain requires the gentle, consistent friction of encountering something it does not already know. A new instrument, attempted badly and with joy. A language learned slowly and imperfectly in a notebook. A subject that has always intimidated you, opened at last. A conversation with someone whose life has been nothing like your own. The discomfort of not quite knowing is not a sign that something is wrong. In the aging brain, it is a sign that something essential is being fed. The patients who stayed sharpest into their 80s and 90s were, almost without exception, people who had retained what I can only call an appetite for the world. They were not all formally educated. They were not all wealthy or well-traveled. But they were all still asking questions, still being surprised, still caring about the answer to something they did not yet understand. I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it rather than answer too quickly. When did you last learn something that genuinely unsettled your understanding? Something that made you think differently, not just know more? That feeling of being unsettled, that mild, vaguely uncomfortable stretching, that is your brain doing exactly what it needs to do to stay alive. If you cannot remember the last time you felt it, I would ask you, kindly and urgently, to consider what that means. Leave me a comment below. Tell me what you are still curious about, what question you have always meant to pursue but kept setting aside. I read every word, and the conversations that begin in those comments have more than once reminded me of what is still possible at any age. The second behavior I observed, and this one took me longer to identify because its effects accumulate so gradually, was the chronic suppression of the body's inflammatory signals. Not through medication or deliberate intervention, but through 3 decades of a particular way of eating, sleeping, and managing what I will call the body's inner weather. Let me be specific, because generalities are where important knowledge goes to die. The patients who developed dementia had, almost universally, spent the preceding 30 or 40 years eating in ways that kept their bodies in a state of low-grade, persistent inflammation. Not dramatically, not in ways that caused obvious illness, just a quiet, constant simmer driven by diets heavy in processed and ultra-processed food, high in refined sugar, low in the deeply colored, fiber-rich plant foods that are the primary language of anti-inflammatory chemistry. They had also, by and large, slept poorly for years. Not catastrophically, most of them did not think of themselves as bad sleepers, but shallowly, interruptedly, insufficiently, and many of them had carried chronic stress without adequate means of discharging it. which kept cortisol elevated in the bloodstream year after year, slowly wearing down the structures of the brain most responsible for memory. There is a woman I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Her name was Constance, and she came to me first at 59 with what she described as just tiredness. She was a school dinner lady who had worked a physical job for 30 years, raised 4 children largely on her own after her husband left, and eaten, as she put it, whatever was fastest and cheapest. She survived on white bread, margarine, tin soup, biscuits from a tin on the counter. She slept 5 or 6 hours a night, always had. She said there was always something that needed doing. She was proud of her toughness. She thought of her ability to keep going on very little as a kind of virtue. I did not say what I should have said clearly enough, which was, your body is not a machine that can run indefinitely on poor fuel and no rest. It is a garden that is being quietly starved. Constance was 71 when the memory problems began. By 74, she could not reliably find her way home from the shops 3 streets away. What I learned from Constance and from dozens of patients like her is that the protection of the aging brain is not a project that begins in old age. It is something that the body has been accumulating evidence for across decades. But, and I want this to reach you clearly, it is also never entirely too late to shift the direction. The brain and the body respond to change. Not instantly and not completely, if enough damage has already been done, but they respond a shift toward deeply colored vegetables, toward fermented foods that restore the gut's living ecosystem, toward real sleep taken seriously and protected as the medical event. It truly is. These things create measurable change in the chemistry of inflammation within months, not decades. I have seen it happen in patients in their 70s and 80s. The windows can be cleaned from the inside, not perfectly, but meaningfully. If what I'm saying feels true to you, if it matches something you have half known but not quite been able to articulate, I would ask you to press the like button on this video. It is a small thing, but it tells me that this conversation is finding the people who need it. And it helps carry these words to others who are sitting right now where you are sitting, wondering the same things you are wondering. The third behavior, the one that is hardest to speak about, and the one I am most certain of, is what I will call the long carrying. The carrying of grief that was never properly mourned, the carrying of anger that was swallowed rather than spoken, the carrying of resentment toward a person or a moment or a decision that calcified over decades into something that never softened, the carrying of a life story in which something went permanently, unforgivably wrong and was never set down. I am a physician. I trained in a tradition that tends to draw a very firm line between the emotional and the biological. And yet, everything I have observed in 65 years of practice tells me that this line is, at the deepest level, a fiction. Chronic emotional distress, grief unmourned, anger unresolved, resentment maintained, produces cortisol. Elevated cortisol, sustained over years, damages the hippocampus. The hippocampus is the seahorse-shaped structure deep in the brain that is most responsible for forming and retrieving memories. This is not a theory or a metaphor. It is documented biology. The heart and the mind are not separate systems. They are one system. What you carry in one, you carry in both. I treated a man named Raymond for many years, a retired engineer from Manchester, 72 when he first came to me, still physically vigorous, still mentally clear. He had been estranged from his eldest son for 19 years over a disagreement that he refused to describe to me in any detail. He had, in his own words, closed that door. He said it with a finality that he clearly believed was a sign of strength, But I could see across the years I knew him what that closed door was costing him. He held it in his jaw, in his shoulders, in the way his breathing never fully reached his belly. He held it in the particular blankness that would cross his face when his grandchildren were mentioned, the grandchildren he had never met. At 78, Raymond began to lose his short-term memory. At 81, the long-term memories began to fragment. The door he had closed was the last solid thing in a house that was slowly losing its walls. I am not telling you to forgive because it is morally right, though I believe that it is. I am telling you to tend to the unfinished business of your emotional life because your brain is depending on it. The chemistry of chronic, unresolved distress is toxic to the structures of memory. This is not weakness. This is not sentiment. This is the body asking you, with increasing urgency, to set something down before it becomes too heavy to carry and too corrosive to survive. I had a patient at 83, a woman named Ada, who came to me 6 months after the death of her husband of 51 years and told me she had not cried since the funeral. She said she did not want to burden her children. She said she was managing. I asked her how she was sleeping. She said not much. I asked her how her memory was. She paused for a long time before answering. Then she said, I keep losing things, not just objects, thoughts. I'll be in the middle of a sentence and the end of it will simply be gone. We spent 3 months, Ada and I, doing something that had nothing whatsoever to do with supplements or diets or exercise. We spent 3 months finding safe ways for her to grieve. By the end, she was sleeping 6 hours instead of 3. The thoughts that had been vanishing began to return. She told me at our last session that she felt she had been given a room back in her own house that she had thought was permanently locked. This is the section of today's conversation that I most need you to share, not for my sake, but because I know that someone in your life, someone you love, is carrying something right now that is too heavy and has been too heavy for too long. Perhaps it is you. Forward this to them. Send it without explanation. Let it arrive as it is. That small act might be the beginning of something that matters more than either of you can know. 65 years, 4,000 patients, give or take, across 2 continents, and many decades of medicine. And when I sit quietly in the early mornings now, in my garden, with the light coming in low the way it does at this time of year, and I think about all the faces I have known, the ones who stayed and the ones who slipped away, what I feel is not only grief, what I feel is something close to obligation. The obligation to say, before I no longer can, what I have learned. Stop surrendering your curiosity. It is the single most powerful act of brain maintenance available to you, and it costs nothing except the willingness to feel slightly uncertain and slightly stretching again. Start tonight not with something grand, but with one question you have been meaning to pursue. Pick up that book. Make that telephone call to the person who knows about the thing you've always wanted to understand. Let the not knowing be interesting rather than threatening. Reduce as best you can the daily insults to your body's chemistry, the processed food, the poor sleep, the stress carried without discharge. Not perfectly, not all at once, but begin, and begin now, because the body responds to intention with a faithfulness that will surprise you. And tend to the long carrying. Whatever it is you have been holding since the year you cannot quite bring yourself to name, the loss, the rupture, the anger that became stone, please find a way to set it down. Not because you owe it to the person or the moment that caused it, because you owe it to the mind and the life that is still yours right now, today. I think of William and Constance and Raymond and Ada. I think of all the people I treated and all the people I did not treat in time. I think of my own teacher, Dr. Luo Baishan, reading his poetry in the garden on that last Tuesday afternoon. I do not know with certainty what kept his mind so clear and so present until the very end, but I know what he was like. He was endlessly curious, still learning, still asking. At 88, he ate simply and with great attention. He grieved what he had lost fully, and then he continued. And he carried very little that he had not examined and set down and made peace with. That is the kind of life I have spent 65 years trying to understand. And this morning, in my garden, with what time I have remaining, it is the kind of life I am still trying to live. Thank you for being here. It has been truly my honor.